This is Lecture 59E in the ABCs of Communism series that accompanies the book, The ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018, Volume 3, Communism in East Asia, and in the chapter on Indonesia. And just to recap for a moment, I think the most important thing for you to remember is that Indonesia, surprising to many of you I suspect in North America, has been at the very heart of the formation of capitalism in Europe and North America from the very beginning. It was Indonesian small farmers, first enslaved de facto by the Dutch, who financed this whole operation, made Holland into the richest country in Europe, and in turn Dutch bankers financed not only development in Holland but in northern Germany, England, northern France, the Benelux countries, and so on. Then the Japanese took over. Japanese imperialism took over the Indonesian people, and after World War II, the U.S. imperialists managed to take over and are still there today. But at any rate, our lecture that concludes this Indonesian part, chapter and series of accompanying lectures, begins with the fight for communism after World War II. Now, you want to remember that after 1927, with the PKI underground, that is the Communist Party of Indonesia, the bourgeoisie under Sukarno and Muhammad Atta dominated the nationalist movement. Then in 1930, the Depression decade began, and it delivered a permanent blow to Indonesia's international trade. Simultaneously, the population rose from 61 million in 1930 to 71 million in 1940. The gross national product fell from 3.5 billion guilders to 2 billion guilders, and the Netherlands colonial regime forced the nationalist movement a step back politically and organizationally, with 13,000 arrests and deportations to the notorious concentration camp at Boven-Digul. Now, Sukarno, being Javan, had only one name, which is common in that part of Indonesia. He was to become an incarcerated leader of his country's struggle for independence from the Netherlands. He was a prominent leader of Indonesia's nationalist movement during the Dutch colonial period, and spent the decade under Dutch colonial detention. In other words, they kept him in prison through the 1930s until he was released by the invading Japanese forces. Now, in 1942, Japan defeated the Dutch forces in Indonesia altogether, and thus ended 3.5 centuries of European colonization. It was also the beginning of the 3.5-year Japanese occupation. Under the Japanese, the Sukarno-Hatta nationalist movement gained momentum because Sukarno and his men collaborated with the Japanese war effort in exchange for Japanese aid in spreading their nationalist ideas. The war is won, the revolution begins. On 17 August 1945, with the Japanese surrender, Sukarno and Muhammad Atta declared Indonesian independence. Sukarno was declared first president, and he led the bourgeois resistance to Dutch recolonization. The Dutch gave up altogether in 1949. However, the Sukarno regime was content to have Indonesia independence submissive to U.S. imperialism. Directly counterpoised were the communists led by Tan Malaka, that we talked about in the last lecture. Sukarno had his thrown together provisional government, and the Reds had the United Front, Persatuan Perjuangan, United Struggle, that demanded 100% independence for Indonesia. As we have seen, Tan Malaka was well known in Indonesia, having been a teacher, PKI activist, and Comintern agent with a philosophical vision. His thinking had led him to found the Struggle Union and the Murba Party. He had patriotically fought as a guerrilla and become an Indonesian national hero. The revolutionaries fought valiantly against the Allied powers and also against the nationalist leaders like Atta, who sought to capitulate to the imperialist powers and return all Dutch companies and plantations, which meant subordinating Indonesia economically to the Dutch once again. The Dutch-loving bourgeois nationalists sent their troops against the PKI's people's militias, who were fighting to defend their new nations. Thousands of brave young fighters were murdered by the Reoccupation Dutch colonial army. In 1945, after the proclamation of Indonesian independence, Tan Malaka began to meet his own people and people of the younger generation. He also started to use his real name after 20 years of using aliases, and he traveled to and in Java and saw Surabaya people fighting against the British Army in November. He realized the differences of struggling between the people in some places and the leaders in Jakarta. He thought the leaders were too weak in negotiation with the Dutch, and Tan Malaka's solution to this perceived disconnect was to found United Action, Persatuan Perjuangan. UA was a coalition of about 140 smaller groups outside the PKI. In mid-January 1946, the coalition was founded by a Congress in Surakarta City in central Java. Its minimum program was complete Indonesian independence and foreign-owned plantations and industry nationalized. UA had widespread popular support as well as in the army, where General Sudirman was a militant supporter of Tan Malaka's coalition. In February 1946, the UA forced the temporary resignation of Prime Minister Sultan Jahir, who was conciliatory toward the Dutch. Sukarno consulted with Tan Malaka to seek his support, but the UA boss was unable to bridge political divisions within his coalition, so Jahir returned to lead Sukarno's cabinet. In 1948, Tan Malaka was in Yogyakarta working to form the Proletarian Party, Partai Murba. Although far smaller than the PKI, the Murba Party constituted an important adjunct to it. Leaders of mass movements largely made up the leadership of the Murba Party, and these young men had been leaders of guerrillas and other mass struggles against the Japanese occupation. The party appealed to all who were dissatisfied with bourgeois post-independence developments. And then Tan Malaka was murdered. In December 1948, the Dutch reoccupation regime wanted Tan Malaka dead. He had established his headquarters in Blimbing, a village surrounded by rice fields. Major Sabaridin, leader of Battalion 38, joined him, which was the only armed group that was really fighting the Dutch. On 17 February 1949, the military Indonesian leaders in East Java decided that Sabaridin and his companions were to be captured and convicted following military law, and along the way on the 19th of February they captured Tan Malaka in Blimbing. On the 20th of February 1949, the infamous Dutch Special Corps troops, KST, started their Operation Tiger from the East Javanese town of Ganjuk. On 21 February 1949, the next day, they executed Tan Malaka, and after he had been wounded in the foothills of Selo Pangun. Malaka was buried unceremoniously in the field. On 27 December 1949, after many courageous battles which claimed the lives of more than 200,000 Indonesians, the Dutch were forced to recognize Indonesian sovereignty. However, the nationalist leaders had sold out Indonesia by agreeing to return all Dutch companies, agricultural lands, and mines, and they had agreed to pay 4.3 billion guilders. This was the price of peace, and this was demanded by the Netherlands government to cover the cost of their aggression against Indonesia in the previous 4 years. This would put the whole of the Indonesian economy under the thumb of the imperialists, and the program of 100% independence was betrayed. The PKI is reborn. In 1950, the PKI started publishing its main organs, Harian Rakyat and Bintang Merah. The PKI principal leader was Dipa Nusantara Adit, who supported the anti-colonialist and anti-Western policy of the Indonesian President Sukarno, as did the younger communist leaders Sudisman, Lukman, and Joto and Sakarman. In 1951, the new leadership was fully in charge of the PKI, and under Adit, the PKI grew rapidly to 165,000 members in 1954 and 1.5 million in 1959. In August 1951, the PKI led a series of militant strikes against the right wing of Sukarno's government. Fascist reprisals in Medan and Jakarta forced the PKI leadership underground for the moment. And in March of '51, the Merba Party joined the conservative body of political parties, a broad coalition initiated by the PKI that soon became non-functional. However, PKI-Merba relations were good, and Merba guerrilla units still roamed in West Java and held some territory under their control. In February 1952, the party supported a parliamentary motion calling for the opening of diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. This is only a little over a year before Stalin's death. Elections. The Merba Party suffered a stark setback in the 1955 election. The party obtained 0.53% of the national vote and won 2 seats from Java in the People's Representative Council, and that was a loss of 4 seats. Afterwards, the Merba Party MPs joined the 10 Java MPs of the National Progressive Fraction. In the 1955 Constituent Assembly, Merba got 4 seats. In 1957, President Sukarno introduced guided democracy. The Merba Party was the first to declare its unconditional support and become one of 10 legal parties. Merba Politico and Minister of Education Priyono became the head of the Guided Democracy Committee. In 1958, there was a rebellion that set up the revolutionary government of the Republic of Indonesia, PRRI. Merba Party cadres were seized by the PRRI rebels and held at the Muara Labu detention camp in West Sumatra. Meanwhile, Adam Malek, a founder of the Merba Party, was appointed Sukarno's Indonesian ambassador to the Soviet Union and Poland. In 1960, Charles Sela of the Merba Party became chairman of the National Council and chairman of the National Front. Now, the inherited mess. In the 1950s, the Indonesian economy was saddled throughout the decade with debt because of the bad deal it had received at the hands of its own traders vis-a-vis the Dutch. The debt situation then went from bad to worse. The 1950s federal budget sustained deficits of 30% annually. In the 1960s, the budgetary deficit soared to more than 100%. And in 1965, prices on consumables rose more than 500%. In 1965, it had reached 300%. In contrast between rich and poor deepened, making Tan Malaka's description of land of the paupers pale in comparison. Nevertheless, the Sukarno government continually announced progress toward a just and prosperous society. Perhaps it was the conspicuous consumption in Jakarta that masked reality for foreign observers. Now, Indonesian Economic Development from 1960 to 1965. Since 1964, the rupiah had been the official currency of Indonesia. And then I have a table that shows each year, 1960 through 1965, and the NDP, the price, the rupee billion prices, and the per capita income percent change, budget deficit, and so on. And I won't try to read that table to you. It'll be in your book when you get it. But the essential thing is that the above raw economic indicators during the period 60 to 65 clearly shows that the Indonesian economy was declining in a catastrophic manner. Within 5 years, inflation rose from 20% to 600%. The budget deficit rose from 17% to 63%, and the immediate and direct causes of this rising inflation, which for the workers and peasants meant a decline in their real wages, were not difficult to detect. The money supply began to rise very quickly, from 40% in the early 60s to 300% by 1965. This increase in the money supply was fed directly by the budget deficit, which the government encouraged by printing more money. The main narrative that had been churned out by the Western capitalist powers was that Sukarno, like many other third world leaders of his time, paid disproportionate attention to political issues at the expense of economic ones, by which they meant he spent too much on social programs to secure votes. The pre-occupation colonial regime had sown economic chaos. Their political policy was to break Indonesia up into smaller, weaker polities by promoting secessionist movements through the archipelago. The regime and the gringo CIA sponsored numerous rebellions that cost a lot of money to suppress. The military endeavor to fight the secessionists was one of the main factors that bankrupted the government. Now, the Balancing Act. The Sukarno government tried to balance between the two main forces, which were, one, the communists and their unions and popular organizations. These encompassed the entire working class, poor farmers, the urban poor, and assorted left-wing intellectuals, artists, and radical nationalists. And two, the Army and Navy under reactionary generals and admirals. Behind the reactionary officers were the rich landowners, right-wing nationalists, and most importantly, the gringo CIA and its imperialist array. The halfway measures of the Sukarno government, that is, wallowing in revolutionary phrases without completing the socialist revolution, doing away with capitalism altogether, and implementing a planned economy under the democratic control of the workers, was, in the end, the essence of the failure. By the January 1st of 1965, the Khrushchev modern revisionists had betrayed the international communist movement, and those parties that had come under the sway were out of luck. One was the Indonesian Communist Party. It refused to take power because it was tied hand and foot to Sukarno's national bourgeoisie by the modern revisionists in the Soviet Union with whom the PKI leaders had sided. In class struggle, there is only one rule. One class has to win and the other has to lose. Now, the situation of pitched class struggle as it was in Indonesia during the late 1950s to the mid-60s could not be maintained forever. One class had to give. The PKI's insistence on putting the class struggle to one side by subordinating it to the national struggle led to its destruction. The PKI refused to recognize the class struggle, but the class struggle recognized the PKI. U.S. imperialism takes command. Before dawn on 1 October 65, the CIA counter-revolutionary coup against Sukarno began as 6 army generals were kidnapped and executed in Jakarta. Then CIA agents led soldiers from the Presidential Guard Diponegoro Division and the Brawijaya Division to the occupation of the Merdeka Square in front of the Presidential Palace, the National Radio Station, and Telecommunications Center. At 7:10 a.m. on 1 October, that day, Untung bin Samsuri announced on radio that the 30 September movement had forestalled a coup attempt on Sukarno by CIA power-mad generals, and that it was an internal army affair. On the other hand, the 30 September movement never made any attempt on Suharto, who had been in Jakarta Army Hospital that evening. Here he was visited by Colonel Abdul Latif, a leader of the 30 September movement and close family friend of Suharto. Latif assumed Suharto, being a Sukarno loyalist, needed to know about the impending kidnapping plan in order to save Sukarno from treacherous generals. However, he found Suharto surprisingly neutral. What was happening was a coup against Sukarno being led by General Suharto and instrumentalized by the CIA. Now Suharto went to Kostrad headquarters just before dawn, from where his soldiers were occupying Merdeka Square. He now mobilized Kostrad and the RPKAD Special Forces and seized control of Jakarta. He took over essential strategic sites, including the radio station, without resistance. Suharto announced the CIA narrative over the radio at 9 p.m. that evening by reporting that 6 generals had been kidnapped by counter-revolutionaries by the 30 September movement that had intended to overthrow Sukarno. He said he was in control of the army and he would crush the 30 September movement and safeguard Sukarno. Suharto issued an ultimatum to the Halem Air Force Base, where the 30th of September movement had based themselves. The next day, on October 2nd, 1965, before Suharto's soldiers occupied the airbase, Sukarno Air Force Commander Omar Dani and PKI chairman Deepa Nusantara Idit had gathered at Halem. By this time, the Suharto faction was firmly in control of the army. 3 days later, on 5 October 65, Suharto led a dramatic public ceremony to bury the generals' bodies, and on 14 October 1965, Suharto was declared army commander. On 27 October 65, a far-right anti-communist league group called KAMI, K-A-M-I, for Kesatuan Aksi Mahasiswa Indonesia, that is in English, Indonesian Students' Action Forum, was formed. Now, this was one of the CIA's most recent types of subversive action organizations. These appear as civil movements, but are actually arms of gringo fascism and would be so for many years to come in many different countries. And I'm sure that you know what I'm talking about. I won't try to repeat all of the countries where this trick has been used. KAMI was one of 3 such outfits created by the CIA as their fronts for overthrowing the Indonesian government. The Big Lie. This intentional misdirection and confusion opened the door to the CIA narrative propaganda that a communist coup attempt had occurred. Further, that the killings on October 1st were cowardly atrocities against Indonesian heroes, and the army then led a campaign to purge Indonesian society, government, and armed forces of the Communist Party and left organizations. The purge spread from Jakarta to much of the rest of the country. At least 500,000 people were murdered while they slept, and as many as 1.5 million were imprisoned. Because of the purge, the army and Islamic radicals effectively eliminated the Indonesian Communist Party. The Super Semar coup. Sukarno continued to command loyalty from large sections of the armed forces as well as the general population, and Suharto was careful not to be seen to be seizing power in his own coup. Therefore, for the next 18 months after defeating the 30 September movement, Suharto made subversive clandestine maneuvers against Sukarno. Chief among these were organizing student agitation, stackling parliament, and media propaganda with sub-rosa military threats. In January 1966, university students under the banner of KAMI began demonstrations against the Sukarno government. Its demands centered on the disbandment of the PKI and control of hyperinflation. The CIA had created the hyperinflation and devaluing of the rupee in order to create discontent among the population. The students received support from the angry price-gouged and devalued wages of wage earners. Suharto, all the while, coordinated with KAMI student leaders and, of course, the CIA handlers. Street fights between the KAMI students and pro-Sukarno loyalists became everyday events. In February 1966, Sukarno promoted Suharto to lieutenant general on his road to full general in July. Then the killing of student demonstrators led Sukarno to order the disbandment of KAMI. He now saw it as a main danger to his regime, but still did not know that Suharto himself was pulling its strings. His recognition of what KAMI really was all about was too little and definitely too late. On the 11th of March 1966, the appearance of unidentified troops around the Merdeka Palace during a cabinet meeting, where Suharto was absent, forced Sukarno to flee by helicopter to Bogor Palace 35 miles away. 3 Suhartoist generals, Major General Busaki Ramat, Brigadier General Ahmed Yusuf, and Brigadier General Amir Mahmoud, went to Bogor to meet Sukarno. They, and Sukarno, gave Suharto authority to take any action necessary to maintain security. The declaration from Bogor was called the Super Semar. The Surat Perintah Sebelas Bare Order of March the 11th was a document signed by President Sukarno on the 11th of March 66 that gave the Army Commander, Lieutenant General Suharto, emergency authority. He was to take whatever measures he deemed necessary to restore order in what appeared to be occurring again at Merdeka Square. The abbreviation Super Semar is a play on the name of Semar, the mystic and powerful figure whom commonly appears in Javanese mythology, including wayang puppet show theatrical performances with puppets or human dancers. Sometimes the puppet itself is referred to as wayang. The invocation of Semar was intended to help draw on Javanese mythology to lend support to Suharto's legitimacy during the de facto coup transition from Sukarno to Suharto. The long arm of the CIA's then principal contractor Rand Corporation and John Howland Rowe, their number one anthropology agent, was revealed. On 12 March 1966, the day I got married and the day following the Super Semar authorization, Suharto banned the PKI. Simultaneously, he started the process of completing the 18-month-long slow-motion coup by purging pro-Sukarno elements from the parliament, the government, and military, accusing them of being communist sympathizers. The army arrested 15 cabinet ministers and forced Sukarno to appoint a new cabinet consisting of Suharto supporters. The army arrested pro-Sukarno and pro-communist members of parliament, and Suharto replaced chiefs of the Navy, Air Force, and the police force with his own men. In turn, they began an extensive purge within each of their respective services that took 3 months to complete. In June of 1966, the now purged parliament passed 24 resolutions, including the banning of Marxism-Leninism, ratifying the Super Semar, and stripping Sukarno of his title of president for life. Against the wishes of Sukarno, the government ended confrontasi with Malaysia and rejoined the United Nations. Because Sukarno had removed Indonesia from the UN in the previous year, Suharto did not seek Sukarno's outright removal at this parliamentary session due to his remaining support. Now, by January 1967, Suharto felt confident that he had removed all significant support for Sukarno within the armed forces and decided Parliament could hold another session to impeach Sukarno, which happened on 22 February 1967, and Sukarno announced he would resign from the presidency. On the 12th of March 1967, 1 year later from the time that all this started, Suharto's parliament stripped Sukarno of his remaining power and named Suharto acting president. Sukarno was placed under house arrest in Bogor Palace, where he died in June 1970. On the 27th of March 1968, a year later, the Parliament appointed Suharto for the first of his 5-year terms as president. This amazingly corrupt regime lasted 30 years. The fourth largest nation with the largest communist party after China and the Soviet Union went from being a staunch anti-imperialist country to a quiet, compliant partner of U.S. imperialism. If not for the Khrushchev modern revision of stopping the PKI from seizing power, all this would have been avoided. Workers were seizing plantations and oil wells owned by U.S. company, and Sukarno had been threatening to nationalize them. The threat of Indonesia going communist had been real, and this event had the potential to turn the Southeast Asian region red as well. Modern revisionism had proved as deadly to the international working class movement as earlier had been anarchism and Trotskyism. Sukarno's CIA regime. Suharto and the Gringo CIA cabal opened the exploitation of Indonesia to the world cap class without limits, and they were richly rewarded. From 1971 to 1981, the total value of exports jumped from US $1.2 billion to US $25.2 billion, a 2,100% increase. From 1965 to 1987, oil and natural gas accounted for more than 50% of the total export value. 80% of the oil and natural gas exports went to Japan and the U.S. Export levels to the U.S. ran second to Japan. This concentration of exports toward the U.S. and Japan began immediately after the Suharto coup was completed. The 1980s plunge of international oil prices dropped from their peak of $35 per barrel in 1980 to below $10 in 1986. Naturally, Indonesian exports suffered also. Petroleum exports were stagnant and fell to 20% of total export share by 2000. In petroleum's place came great increases in plywood exports as well as textile and garment exports. These are, of course, where the cheapest labor could be kettled by the caps, and they had to be competitive in electronic products and found ways of using the cheapest labor there also. Indonesia was replacing its export economy based on raw materials with a sweatshop economy. At the end of the 1980s, there was an increase of exports originating in Java, which had a large workforce and the capacity to produce industrial goods for exports. In 1998, the last forms of the CIA Suharto corrupt regime collapsed. Since then, the PKI has been struggling to get above ground against the successive gringo attempts to maintain control over Indonesia with varying degrees of success. Still outlawed, it has a long road to hoe. By 2000, export markets had also changed. Trade in industrial products with Korea, Taiwan, and China replaced Japan and the ASEAN countries as the cornerstone of foreign trade. The table I give below shows the trend of Indonesia's export economy from 1970 to 2000. And I'm not going to bother to try to read that here. It's in your book when you get it. On working class growth, Indonesia experienced a shift from agricultural and mining products to manufactured commodities. Before the CIA Suharto coup, commodity manufacture was 10% of GDP. By 1990, manufacturing contributed to 30% of total GDP growth, and by 1993, there had been an annual 9% growth in jobs in large and medium-scale manufacturing enterprises. Millions of people relocated from the rural areas to the urban factories. Thousands of new proletarians entered factories, becoming the target of PKI trade unionism, which soon rocked the Suharto regime, and recorded strikes rose in the 1990s from 61 in 1990 to 300 in 1994. Most of these occurred in manufacturing, especially the low-wage textile, clothing, and footwear industries. And then I go through the non-oil and gas GDP and employment share by sector from 76 to 2007, and I'm not going to try to read that all to you. It's in a table, which you'll get on page 10 of that chapter when you get it. Between 76 and 77, to summarize, the non-oil and gas GDP grew by 7.5% a year on average. Agriculture as a percentage of GDP gradually declined from 37% in 76 to 16.4% in 97, while manufacturing GDP increased from 10.6% in 76 to 28.4% in 97. Employment share in the agricultural sector also experienced a gradual decline from 61.6% in 1976 to 41.2% in 97, while the employment share in the manufacturing sector increased from 8.4% to 12.9% during the same period. Manufacturing workers are now far more prevalent in Indonesia in numbers and in terms of their contribution to the GDP per head count. In 2007, while only accounting for 12.5% employment, the manufacturing workers contributed 27% to GDP, whereas the agricultural sector with 41% employment only contributed 15% of GDP. Self-employed men, women, and children working on their own or with the help of unpaid family workers made up a high percentage of the labor force. This massive informal sector accounts for 60 to 70 million people who are forced to create their own meager employment for lack of jobs available. This, of course, is exactly what the caps want to have. That is a desperate, poverty-stricken mass of people to be used as scabs against unionization. And then I have a chart of the trend in employment from 86 to 2007, the essence of which is that the workforce wage earners, both regular and casual, numbered 26.4% in 86 rising to 38.5% in 2007. The drop in the informal sector was in inverse proportion. Self-employed workers and unpaid family workers declined from 73% to 58.6%. From 1997 to 2003, there was a drop in regular wage earning workers in the labor pool to 26% in 2003. As the 1997 cap depression wore off, the number of regular wage earning workers rose to pre-1997 levels by 2005, and that number rose to 28% by 2007. Historically, the cyclical cap depressions have always been the same, whether in Europe or North America, as we saw in Volume 1 and Part 4 on labor history. We can see that Indonesia as well. The post-Suharto CIA declines in unionized wage earner numbers meant unpaid family workers had taken up the slack. The regular wage worker is more common in manufacturing and services. By 2000 in Indonesia, 40% of workers in non-agricultural sectors were wage-earning workers compared to just 6% in agriculture. But that 6% was a rise from 0.3% in '86 to 6% in 2007. The proletariat in Indonesia was and is clearly increasing in numbers as farmers lost their livelihood to industrial latifundistas. Now, this rapid industrialization has led to a growth of women and children into the proletarian ranks. This has always been the case as well, whether in Europe, in North America, or Indonesia. Despite the brutal exploitation and the forceful integration of young girls from the villages into the factories, their jobs and struggles have transformed the lives, social status, and self-confidence of the once so obedient Indonesian woman. They are no longer passive victims of exploitation and injustice, and they have become active agents of their own social change, and very often are more vocal than their male counterparts. Not a few have become leaders of unions in popular struggles. In 2004, Indonesia faced a mini-crisis due to international oil price rises and imports. The currency reached 12,000 rupees per US dollars before stabilizing. The election of the reformist president Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono started another bourgeois hope and crash round. In 2005, the regime cut fuel subsidies, shifting loss from theft and cap depression to working people, and this led to a more than doubling in the price of consumer fuels, resulting in double-digit inflation. The economy continued to struggle with inflation at 17%. By 2006, Indonesia's economic growth accelerated to 5.8%. Corruption caused a 5.7 billion US dollars to be lost annually, which was 1.4% of GDP. Housemaid workers brought in significant amounts of foreign exchange reserves, as much as 5 billion US dollars in 2006, and this was twice the value of agricultural exports. By December of 2007, the unemployment rate for Indonesia was at 6.3%, and in 2008, the number of newly arrived migrant workers was about 5.8 million. Another way of looking at this phenomena is that half of the total employment in the medium and large-scale manufacturing sectors is newly arrived, and the majority of that is female, and they work in the informal sectors as housemaids. The rest work in the agricultural and industrial sectors as day laborers, and many do housemaid work but have managed to form trade unions to fight for their rights. In February of 2008, it stood at 8.46% in its unemployment. After India and China, Indonesia is currently the third fastest growing economy in the G20. And in 2012, the unemployment rate for Indonesia was at 6%. And that brings us to a conclusion of our 5-lecture series on Indonesia. Next time we're going to go to the next most important category in the East Asia area, which is the overseas Chinese. And the leading authority on that is our old friend Mr. Sterling Seagram. And he wrote a book called Lords of the Rim. So for those of you who are waiting to get this book next year, I would suggest in the meantime you read that book. And I will be using it as a guide as we summarize the role of the overseas Chinese, which is as great as any single country in Asia outside of the People's Republic of China. The two of them together will make this Belt and Road Initiative that will link China from Beijing to the Ruhr Valley of Germany a reality. And that's it.